What if the smartest people in the room are not the ones talking? What if everything you have been taught about success, about standing out, about proving your worth, has been quietly working against you? We live in a world that rewards noise. Speak up. Sell yourself. Fill the silence before someone else does. From school to the workplace to social media, we are trained to believe that value must be announced, that intelligence must be performed, that if you are not talking, you are somehow losing. But look closer at the people who actually hold power. The ones who move markets, win negotiations, led nations, calm rooms simply by walking into them. And you will notice something strange. They are not the loudest. They are not the fastest to react. They are more often than not quiet. Deliberately, strategically quiet. This is not shyness. This is not social anxiety. This is not weakness dressed up as mystery. This is a skill, one of the oldest and most underestimated forms of power that exists, and almost nobody teaches it to you on purpose. Silence used correctly is not the absence of communication. It is one of the most sophisticated forms of communication there is. It withholds information from those who would use it against you. It creates space for others to reveal themselves. It signals control in moments when everyone else is losing theirs. And paired with patience, the willingness to wait, to let a moment ripen instead of forcing it, silence becomes something close to a weapon. The kind that never has to be drawn to be felt. This is what we are going to explore together. Not silence as retreat, but silence as strategy. Not patience as passivity, but patience as the highest form of discipline. We are going to look at the psychology behind why silence unsettles people. The neuroscience of impulse and restraint. The negotiators and leaders throughout history who understood that the person who speaks first often loses leverage in the everyday moments in your own life, in your relationships, your career, your conflicts, where staying quiet at exactly the right moment could change everything. By the end of this, you will not see silence the same way again. You will not see the quiet person in the meeting, the one who waits, watches, and speaks only when it matters, as someone who has nothing to say. You will recognize them for what they actually are. Someone who understands something almost everyone else has forgotten. That power does not announce itself. It waits. Chapter 1. The Myth of the Loud Room. From the moment you could speak, you were taught that being heard meant being valued. Raise your hand. Speak up in class. Make yourself known. This lesson was not malicious. It came from good intentions, but it planted something deep and largely false into the way most people move through the world. The belief that visibility equals worth and that silence equals invisibility and invisibility equals irrelevance. Walk into almost any group setting, a classroom, a boardroom, a family dinner, and watch what happens. Someone starts talking almost immediately, filling the space before it has a chance to breathe. Not because they necessarily have something essential to say, but because the silence itself feels unbearable, like a vacuum that must be filled or it will somehow swallow them. This reflex is so common that we rarely question it, but it is worth asking, where did it come from and who does it actually serve? In most social and professional environments, we conflate talking with competence. The person who speaks the most in a meeting is often assumed to be the most engaged, the most knowledgeable, the most invested. Studies on group dynamics have shown that people who talk more are frequently rated as more intelligent and more influential by their peers, regardless of the actual quality or accuracy of what they are saying. This is a strange and important discovery. It means that in many rooms airtime is mistaken for authority. Volume is mistaken for value. And this creates a kind of arms race where everyone feels pressure to speak simply to avoid being overlooked, even when they have nothing particularly useful to add. But here is the paradox that smart, strategic people eventually discover, often the hard way. The more you talk without necessity, the more you reveal, and the less mysterious and therefore the less powerful you become. Every unnecessary sentence is a small transaction. You are trading information, certainty, and sometimes vulnerability for the temporary comfort of not sitting in silence. Meanwhile, the people who resist this urge, who let a pause stretch a little longer than is comfortable, who choose their words with deliberate scarcity, often walk away from the same interaction, having given away far less and having learned far more. Because while everyone else was busy talking, they were watching, listening, and calculating. Think of the most respected, quietly powerful person you have ever encountered. Not the loudest person in the room, but the one whose presence seemed to change its temperature the moment they arrived, and whose words, when they finally came, carried unusual weight. That weight was not accidental. It was earned through restraint. When a person speaks rarely and precisely, their words are treated as valuable simply because they are rare. This is basic economics applied to communication. Scarcity increases perceived worth. If you say 10 things in a conversation, the room absorbs perhaps 2 or 3 of them and forgets the rest by tomorrow. If you say one thing deliberately at the right moment, it lands and it stays. This is not a call to become withdrawn or emotionally distant. It is a call to recognize that the instinct to fill every silence, to explain yourself constantly, to prove your intelligence out loud in every interaction is not actually serving you. It is depleting your leverage one unnecessary sentence at a time. The myth of the loud room is that dominance belongs to whoever speaks first and most. The truth, the one strategic minds throughout history have understood, is closer to the opposite. Dominance often belongs to whoever can comfortably outlast the silence and speak last. And speak least and still be remembered as the one who mattered most. Consider how this plays out in a job interview. One of the most anxiety-inducing forms of social performance. Most people will experience repeatedly in their lives. Candidates are often coached to fill every second, to have an answer ready before the question is finished, to avoid at all costs the appearance of hesitation. But interviewers who conduct hundreds of these conversations often report the opposite preference. That candidates who pause briefly before answering a difficult question, who visibly think rather than recite, come across as more thoughtful, more genuine, and more capable of handling complexity under pressure than those who respond instantly with polished, rehearsed language. The instant response can feel impressive in the moment, but it often reads on some subconscious level as performance rather than substance. A brief pause signals the opposite. That the answer being given is being constructed in real time, tailored specifically to the question rather than pulled from a script. This same dynamic shows up in classrooms, in family disagreements, in first dates, in almost any setting where two people are trying consciously or not to establish who holds more social ground. The person who needs to fill every silence is, without realizing it, communicating a kind of dependency on the interaction going well immediately. A need for reassurance that the moment is safe. The person who can tolerate a pause, who does not chase approval through constant speech, communicates something entirely different. A quiet sense that they do not need this particular moment to validate them. And paradoxically, that sense of not needing the room's approval is precisely what tends to earn it. This is worth sitting with because it reframes something most people have spent their entire lives getting backwards. The goal was never to become invisible or to withhold out of fear or to mistake silence itself for wisdom. Plenty of quiet people say very little simply because they have very little to say, and that is not what we are describing here. What we are describing is a deliberate chosen restraint practiced by people who have plenty to say and choose strategically when saying it will actually serve them. That distinction between silence born of insecurity and silence born of discipline is the difference that separates someone who is simply overlooked from someone who is quietly, unmistakably in control of the room. Chapter 2: Why the Brain Fears Silence. To understand why silence feels so uncomfortable to most people, and therefore why mastering it gives you such a distinct advantage, we have to look at what is actually happening inside the brain during a pause in conversation. Silence is not neutral to the nervous system. An unfilled gap in social interaction can register as a kind of low-grade threat. Humans evolved as intensely social creatures. And for most of our history, being excluded from the group, misread by others, or perceived as awkward or incompetent carried real survival consequences. A silence that stretches too long can trigger the same discomfort circuitry that once helped our ancestors detect social rejection. Because for tens of thousands of years, social standing was tied directly to safety, resources, and reproduction. Your brain, even now, in a world where an awkward pause at work will not get you exiled from a tribe, still treats prolonged silence as something to resolve quickly. And it does this by generating a very specific kind of internal pressure. An urge to speak, to explain, to fill the gap with almost anything just to relieve the tension. This is why so many people blurt out information they did not intend to share, agree to things they had not fully considered, or overexplain a simple statement until it becomes a confession. It is not that they lack discipline. It is that their nervous system is doing exactly what it evolved to do. Treating silence as a problem that must be solved immediately. Understanding this single mechanism changes everything. Because once you recognize that the discomfort of silence is a biological reflex rather than an accurate signal that something is wrong, you can begin to separate the sensation from the response. The feeling of unease during a pause does not mean you must speak. It simply means your nervous system is doing what it has always done. The strategic advantage belongs to whoever can sit with that discomfort a few seconds longer than the other person. In negotiation research, this delay has a name. Some call it the power of the pause. And it has been observed again and again in high-stakes conversations that the first person to break an uncomfortable silence after a proposal or a difficult question is often the one who ends up conceding ground. Whether that concession is a lower price, a weaker position, or unnecessary information handed over simply to relieve tension. This is not a coincidence. It is neurology being exploited consciously or unconsciously by whoever has learned to tolerate discomfort slightly better than the person across from them. There is also a cognitive dimension to this fear of silence that goes beyond simple social anxiety. The brain is a prediction machine, constantly trying to anticipate what happens next in any interaction. Silence removes new information, which means the brain has nothing fresh to process. And in the absence of new data, it often defaults to filling the gap with anxious speculation, imagining judgment, disapproval, or misunderstanding where none may exist at all. This is why silence can feel so much louder, so much more charged than it actually is. The other person may simply be thinking or waiting or genuinely comfortable while your own mind manufactures a narrative of tension that does not reflect reality. Learning to recognize this gap between what silence actually is, a neutral absence of sound, and what your brain interprets it as a potential threat is one of the most practical skills you can develop. It allows you to stop reacting to your own internal alarm system and start responding to what is actually happening in front of you. The people who use silence strategically are not immune to this discomfort. They feel it too. The difference is that they have trained themselves to notice the urge to speak and then choose deliberately whether speaking actually serves the moment rather than simply relieving their own nervous tension. That distinction between reacting to discomfort and choosing your response despite it is where real strategic patience begins. There is a useful exercise here, one that many people who eventually master strategic silence describe stumbling into by accident before turning it into a deliberate practice. The next time you feel that familiar itch to speak during a pause, whether in a meeting, an argument, or a casual conversation, try silently counting to 3 before you respond. It sounds almost too simple to matter, but the effect can be significant. That short delay is often enough time for the reactive urge to pass and for a more considered response to surface in its place. Many people who try this for the first time are surprised to notice that what they were about to say, the thing that felt so urgent to voice half a second earlier, no longer feels necessary once the initial pressure has eased. This is powerful evidence that much of what we say in conversation is not driven by genuine necessity but by the discomfort of the gap itself over time. As this becomes a habit rather than a conscious effort, something interesting happens. The discomfort of silence itself begins to diminish. The nervous system, like any system, adapts to repeated exposure. Just as someone who practices public speaking repeatedly becomes less anxious about it over time, Someone who practices tolerating silence repeatedly becomes less rattled by it until eventually what once felt like an unbearable gap becomes simply comfortably quiet. Chapter 3. The Power Dynamics of Silence. Every conversation, whether people realize it or not, is a negotiation over control. And silence is one of the most powerful, least understood instruments in that negotiation. To see this clearly, consider what actually happens in the moments after someone asks a difficult question, makes an accusation, or presents an offer. The natural instinct for most people is to respond quickly, to fill the space, to demonstrate that they have an answer ready. But speed in these moments is rarely a sign of strength. It is far more often a sign of discomfort, a need to escape the pressure of the pause rather than a genuine readiness to respond well. Those who understand power dynamics instinctively, whether through experience, training, or natural temperament, tend to do the opposite. They let the question sit. They let the accusation hang in the air a beat longer than is comfortable. Not because they are unsure of themselves, but because they understand a simple truth. Whoever is most uncomfortable with silence usually moves first. And whoever moves first usually reveals the most. This dynamic plays out constantly in negotiations, whether over salary, business deals, or the terms of a relationship. When one party names a price or a position, and then goes quiet, refusing to soften it, explain it, or immediately negotiate against themselves, the pressure shifts entirely onto the other side. Most people uncomfortable with the tension of an unanswered silence begin bargaining against their own interests simply to end the discomfort, offering concessions that were never actually asked for. This is not manipulation in the deceptive sense. It is simply an understanding of how discomfort moves through a room and who it tends to move first. Silence also functions as a kind of mirror. When you do not immediately respond to a provocative statement, a passive-aggressive comment, or an attempt to bait you into a reaction, you deny the other person the reaction they were seeking, which often unsettles them far more than a defensive response would. People who attempt to provoke, control, or manipulate through conversation are frequently relying on your predictable reaction. Take that reaction away, replace it with calm, unreadable quiet, and you remove their leverage entirely. This is why so many skilled negotiators, interrogators, and leaders describe silence as one of their most effective tools. Not because it is aggressive, but because it is almost impossible to counter. You cannot argue with quiet. You cannot manipulate someone who refuses to reveal what they are thinking, and you cannot easily read the next move of someone who has not shown you their hand. There is also a subtler layer to this dynamic. The way silence shapes perceived status in many social and professional hierarchies. The person with less power is expected to fill space, to explain themselves, to justify their presence or their position. The person with more power is often permitted, even expected, to say less because their position does the talking for them. This means that practicing selective confident silence can actually shift how others perceive your status. Even before your position has formally changed, when you stop over-explaining, stop rushing to justify every decision, stop filling every pause out of anxiety, people begin to read you differently. Not as someone withholding out of arrogance, but as someone secure enough not to need constant validation through speech. This shift is subtle, but over time it compounds. The colleague who speaks rarely but precisely becomes the one whose opinion is sought out in difficult moments. The friend who listens more than they advise becomes the one people trust with their hardest truths. The negotiator who lets silence do the work becomes the one who consistently walks away with better terms. None of this requires deception or coldness. It requires only the willingness to resist the urge to fill every gap and the discipline to let silence do what words often cannot. Apply pressure without confrontation and reveal truth without demanding it. There is another dimension to these power dynamics worth examining closely. The way silence functions in moments of conflict, specifically when two people disagree. The instinct for most is to escalate verbally, to counter each point immediately, to make sure their side of the argument is fully represented in real time. But this instinct, however natural, often works against the person employing it. Rapid, reactive arguing tends to produce sloppier reasoning, more emotional language, and statements that are easier for the other side to pick apart or use against you later. A person who instead listens fully, lets the other party finish completely, allows a pause after they have spoken and only then responds, tends to produce sharper, more precise, more difficult to counter arguments simply because they gave themselves the time to actually think rather than simply react. This also has a powerful secondary effect on the other party. Being met with calm silence rather than immediate counter-argument frequently causes people to soften their own position or even to start arguing against themselves, filling the silence by qualifying, softening or reconsidering what they just said without you having said a single word in response. Skilled mediators and therapists rely on this phenomenon constantly. Understanding that silence held with genuine attentiveness rather than coldness often does more to de-escalate a conflict than any well-chosen counter-argument could. The silence is not empty. It is doing work that talking simply cannot do, because it gives both parties the space to hear themselves fully without interruption, without immediate rebuttal, and often without meaning to. They begin to hear the weaker parts of their own position. This power dynamic extends into everyday relationships as well, not just formal negotiations or heated arguments. Consider the difference between a partner who responds to every complaint immediately with a defense or a counterpoint and one who listens fully, allows a genuine pause, and only then responds with something considered. The first pattern, however well-intentioned, often escalates conflict because it can feel to the other person like they are being argued with before they have even finished being heard. The second pattern, though it requires more discipline in the moment, tends to de-escalate tension almost automatically because it communicates something the first pattern cannot. That the listener valued understanding the full complaint more than they valued defending themselves quickly over time. In any long-term relationship, whether personal or professional, this difference compounds. People remember not just what was said in difficult moments, but how they were made to feel while saying it. And a partner or colleague who consistently offers the gift of a genuine pause before responding earns a particular kind of trust that fast, reactive communicators rarely manage to build. The trust that comes from feeling truly heard rather than simply tolerated until it was someone else's turn to talk. Chapter 4. Silence as Strategy. Throughout history, long before modern negotiation theory or psychological research put language to this idea, history's most effective strategists, leaders, and diplomats understood, often through hard experience, that restraint could accomplish what words could not. Military commanders throughout history have long recognized that revealing your full intentions, your full strength, or your full plan before it is necessary is one of the fastest ways to lose an advantage. Ancient strategic texts on warfare consistently emphasize the value of concealment, patience, and the deliberate withholding of information, teaching that an opponent who cannot read your next move is an opponent who cannot effectively counter it. This principle extended far beyond the battlefield. Throughout history, some of the most effective diplomats and political figures were known not for their eloquence, but for their extraordinary discretion, choosing their words so sparingly that a single sentence from them could shift the outcome of an entire negotiation precisely because they had not diluted their credibility with unnecessary talk. In courts and councils throughout different eras and cultures, advisors who spoke rarely but decisively were often more trusted and more feared than those who offered constant opinions on every matter. Their silence created a kind of authority because it suggested depth, calculation, and control. While excessive talk was frequently associated with anxiety, weakness, or a desperate need for approval. This pattern repeats across very different contexts and eras, which suggests it is not a cultural accident but something closer to a universal principle of human power dynamics. Consider also the strategic patience shown by leaders during moments of crisis or provocation throughout history. Figures who managed to hold their tongue during moments of intense pressure, who refused to respond impulsively to insults, threats, or attempts at provocation, often emerged from those situations with far more credibility and leverage than those who reacted immediately. A hasty emotional response in a moment of high tension can hand an opponent exactly the reaction they were hoping for. While a composed silence followed by a measured response delivered on one's own timeline denies them that satisfaction entirely and often reframes the entire situation in the karma party's favor. This same principle appears again and again in the biographies of highly successful business leaders, many of whom describe a deliberate practice of waiting before responding to criticism, bad news, or high-pressure decisions, allowing the initial emotional reaction to pass before speaking or acting. Precisely because the first response, the reflexive one, is rarely the wisest one. What connects all of these historical examples across war rooms, royal courts, boardrooms, and diplomatic tables is not coldness or manipulation, but a shared understanding that impulsive speech is often a liability. While deliberate silence paired with patience creates room for better judgment, stronger positioning and outcomes that serve long-term interests rather than short-term emotional relief. The historical record is in this sense remarkably consistent. Across centuries and cultures, the people who accumulated real lasting influence were rarely the ones who spoke the most. They were the ones who understood exactly when speaking would cost them something and chose again and again to wait. This pattern is not limited to grand political or military settings. It appears just as clearly in the history of business and industry. Many of the most consequential deals, mergers, and strategic pivots in modern commercial history were shaped not by the party who talked the fastest or negotiated the most aggressively, but by the party willing to let silence stretch across a negotiating table until the other side revealed more than they intended to. Experienced dealmakers frequently describe a specific tactic, stating a position clearly and then simply stopping, resisting every urge to justify, soften, or elaborate further, no matter how long the silence that follows. This forces the other party to either accept the terms as stated or reveal their own position by responding first. And in either case, the silent party retains the advantage. It is worth noting that this approach requires genuine internal steadiness, not simply the appearance of it, because a bluff of silence, one used without real conviction behind it, tends to crack under sustained pressure, and skilled negotiators on the other side of the table can often sense the difference between someone who is comfortable with the quiet and someone who is merely enduring it. This is why strategic silence throughout history and in the modern world alike is never simply a technique to be deployed mechanically. It is the visible expression of a deeper internal state, a genuine comfort with uncertainty, with not being liked in every moment, with allowing tension to exist without rushing to resolve it. Those who mastered this across different eras were not simply performing patience for effect. They had cultivated an authentic tolerance for discomfort that made their silences credible. And it was that authenticity more than any specific tactic that gave their restraint its true power. Even outside the realm of formal negotiation and statecraft, this historical pattern shows up in the way influential thinkers, writers, and public figures across generations chose to engage or not engage with criticism and controversy. Many of the figures remembered as having the most enduring credibility were not those who responded to every attack, every rumor, or every provocation directed at them, but those who let a great deal go unanswered, trusting that their track record, their work, and their consistency would speak more convincingly over time than any immediate rebuttal could. This restraint often frustrated their contemporaries in the moment. Critics and supporters alike sometimes wished they would defend themselves more loudly or more often. But history frequently vindicated the quieter approach because a reputation built on selective considered responses tends to age far better than one built on constant reactive defense. Every unanswered provocation that fades into irrelevance strengthens the credibility of the person who declined to engage with it, while every argument entered into, even a winning one, still carries the residue of having been drawn into the fight at all. This is perhaps the deepest lesson silence offers across history. That the truest measure of strength is often not what a person says in their most heated moments, but what they choose deliberately and repeatedly to leave unsaid. Chapter 5. The Neuroscience of Impulse and Restraint. Every time you feel the urge to respond immediately, to defend yourself, to correct someone, to fill a silence, or to react to a provocation, a very specific process is unfolding inside your brain. And understanding it gives you the ability to interrupt it. When something triggers an emotional reaction, whether it is an insult, a surprising question, or simply the discomfort of a pause, the brain's threat detection system activates almost instantly, faster than conscious thought. This system evolved to keep us safe from immediate physical danger. And it does not distinguish particularly well between a genuine threat and a social one, such as embarrassment, disagreement, or being put on the spot. In response, the body prepares for quick action. And this often translates into an urge to speak immediately, to defend, explain, or react before the slower, more deliberate parts of the brain have had a chance to fully engage. This slower system, responsible for reasoning, weighing consequences, and considering long-term outcomes, is remarkably powerful. But it is also comparatively slow, and it requires a moment, sometimes just a few seconds, to fully come online. This is the neurological basis for one of the most practical truths about strategic silence: that the first response you feel is rarely the response you should give. It is the reactive system speaking, not the deliberate one. People who appear naturally calm, measured, and strategic in high-pressure situations are very often not calmer by temperament than everyone else. They have simply trained themselves through practice or experience to recognize that initial surge of reactive urgency and let it pass before acting. This is sometimes described as creating a gap between stimulus and response. And that gap, however brief, is where all real strategic thinking actually happens. Without it, we are simply reacting, driven by whatever emotional or social pressure is present in the moment. With it, we regain the ability to choose. Research on self-regulation consistently shows that this capacity to pause before reacting is not a fixed trait. It is a skill that strengthens with deliberate practice. Much like a muscle, every time you notice the urge to respond immediately, and instead choose to wait, even for a few seconds, you are reinforcing the neural pathways associated with restraint, making it slightly easier the next time. Conversely, every time you give into the impulse to react instantly, whether by speaking too soon, defending yourself too quickly, or filling a silence out of discomfort, you reinforce the opposite pattern, making impulsivity feel more natural and restraint feel more difficult. This is why strategic silence is not simply a personality trait that some people have and others lack. It is closer to a trained response built through repeated conscious choices to resist the pull of the reactive brain. There is also an important physiological component to this practice. In moments of heightened emotional arousal, whether from anger, anxiety, or excitement, the ability to think clearly and speak with precision is measurably reduced. Decisions and statements made in this heightened state are far more likely to be regretted later because they are shaped more by the body's stress response than by careful judgment. This is precisely why pausing before responding, especially in emotionally charged situations, so consistently produces better outcomes. It is not a mystical or purely psychological effect. It reflects a genuine physiological shift, allowing the nervous system to settle enough for clearer thinking to actually take place. The practical implication of all this is significant. When you feel the strong urge to speak immediately, particularly in a moment of tension, provocation, or discomfort, that urge itself is information, but it is not an instruction. It is a signal that your reactive system has been activated, not necessarily a signal that speaking is the right move. Learning to notice that signal, name it internally, and then deliberately choose whether to act on it or to wait is the neurological foundation upon which every other strategic use of silence and patience is built. It is also worth understanding what happens in the brain during the waiting itself. Because this period of restraint is not simply passive suppression. It is active processing. While you hold back an impulsive response, the brain continues working in the background, integrating additional context, weighing possible outcomes, and often generating a more nuanced understanding of the situation than was available in the first instant of reaction. This is why a response delivered after even a short pause often sounds noticeably more measured, more precise, and more persuasive than one delivered instantly. The extra time allowed for genuine cognitive integration rather than pure emotional discharge. Athletes who perform under extreme pressure often describe a similar phenomenon. The ability to slow down a moment that objectively lasts only a fraction of a second, creating enough internal space to make a better decision than instinct alone would produce. This capacity is not reserved for elite performers. It is available to anyone willing to practice it deliberately. In conversations, in conflicts, in decisions large and small, the brain rewards repetition. Each time you successfully resist an impulsive reaction and choose a measured response instead, you are not simply making a better choice in that single moment. You are subtly reshaping the neural architecture that governs how you respond to pressure in every future moment as well. Building quite literally a more patient and more strategic mind, one deliberate pause at a time. This is also why restraint tends to feel difficult at first and gradually feel almost effortless with sustained practice. Much like any other skill that depends on rewiring an existing habit. In the beginning, resisting the urge to speak immediately can feel like fighting against your own nature. An uncomfortable, almost physical tension between what you feel compelled to do and what you have decided deliberately to do instead. This discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is simply the sensation of an old pattern being interrupted before a new one has fully taken hold. With repetition, this tension gradually decreases. Not because the initial impulse disappears entirely, but because the gap between impulse and considered response becomes shorter and more automatic to access until eventually what once required conscious effort becomes something closer to your natural first response. This is the quiet cumulative advantage of practicing strategic silence deliberately rather than waiting for it to arrive naturally on its own. It transforms restraint from something you have to force yourself into moment by uncomfortable moment into something closer to your default operating mode. Freeing up mental energy that was previously spent managing impulsive reactions and redirecting that energy instead toward clearer thinking, sharper observation, and ultimately far more deliberate and effective action. Chapter 6. Strategic Silence in Negotiation and Business. Walk into any high-stakes business negotiation and you will find two very different philosophies operating in the same room, often without either side fully realizing it. One philosophy treats negotiation as a performance, a chance to demonstrate confidence through constant talking, quick counter-offers, and a steady stream of justifications for every position taken. The other philosophy, the one favored by the most consistently successful negotiators across industries, treats negotiation as a game of information where the person who reveals the least while learning the most tends to walk away with the better outcome. Silence is the primary tool of the second philosophy. And once you understand why, you will start noticing it everywhere. Consider the moment after an offer has been placed on the table. The instinct for most people is to immediately explain the reasoning behind their number, to soften it with qualifiers, or to nervously ask what the other party thinks. Each of these instincts, however natural, gives something away. Explaining your reasoning reveals your constraints. Softening your number signals flexibility before any concession was actually requested. Asking for immediate feedback invites the other party to respond before you have had a chance to observe their unguarded reaction to your position, which is often the most honest signal you will get in the entire negotiation. Experienced negotiators do something different. They state their position clearly and then they stop. They let the silence stretch sometimes for an uncomfortably long time and they watch the other party's face, posture, and hesitation in that silence often reveal more than anything they could say aloud. Because unguarded reactions tend to surface most clearly in the moments before a person has had time to construct a careful verbal response. This is one of the quiet underappreciated advantages of silence in negotiation. It does not just protect your own information. It extracts information from the other side. Information they would never have handed over voluntarily through words. There is also a well-documented psychological pattern that plays out in these silences. Sometimes called the discomfort of the unanswered offer. When a proposal is met with quiet rather than an immediate counter, the party who made the offer frequently begins to doubt their own position, wondering if they asked for too much or too little or framed something poorly. This self-doubt, entirely internally generated, often leads them to soften their own offer without the other side having said a single word, simply to relieve the tension of the silence. This is not trickery. It is simply an accurate understanding of how discomfort operates in high-pressure exchanges. And the party who can tolerate that discomfort longest holds a structural advantage that has nothing to do with the actual strength of their position and everything to do with their nervous system's tolerance for an unfilled pause. Beyond individual negotiations, this same principle shapes broader business reputations. Executives and founders who are known for measured and frequent public statements rather than constant commentary on every development tend to be taken more seriously when they do finally speak, because the market has learned that their words are not filler. They are signal. A public statement from someone who rarely comments carries weight precisely because of its scarcity. While constant commentary, even when accurate, gradually loses its impact through sheer repetition. This is why some of the most respected voices in business are also some of the quietest, choosing their public moments carefully, understanding that credibility, like currency, loses value when it is spent too freely. In internal company settings, this same restraint often determines who gets promoted into positions of real influence. Employees who speak in every meeting on every topic, whether or not they have genuine expertise, are frequently perceived over time as less discerning, their input harder to distinguish from simple habit. Employees who listen carefully contribute only when they have something substantive to add and can comfortably sit through a silence without feeling compelled to fill it are often perceived as more senior in judgment even before their title reflects it, because their communication pattern already resembles the pattern associated with people who hold real decision-making power. This principle extends into how businesses handle moments of crisis or public scrutiny as well. When something goes wrong, a product failure, a public controversy, a difficult quarter, the instinct for many organizations is to respond immediately, to issue a statement within hours, to appear as though every question has already been answered. But some of the most respected crisis responses in business history have followed the opposite pattern. A brief controlled silence while the situation is genuinely assessed, followed by a single carefully considered statement rather than a flurry of reactive comments that often have to be walked back or contradicted as more information emerges. Organizations that rush to fill the silence during a crisis frequently end up compounding the damage, because early statements made under pressure before the full picture is understood are far more likely to contain errors, contradictions, or tone that ages poorly once more facts surface. A measured pause, even a short one, allows for a response built on actual understanding rather than the urgent need to be seen responding. And audiences, whether customers, investors, or the public, often extend more patience and goodwill to an organization that takes a beat to respond thoughtfully than one that reacts instantly and imperfectly. There is a similar dynamic in how salary and compensation conversations tend to unfold. Candidates who immediately accept an initial offer or who feel compelled to fill every pause during a compensation discussion with additional justification for their value frequently leave money and leverage on the table that a more patient approach would have captured. Simply asking for time to consider an offer and genuinely taking that time rather than responding instantly out of relief or anxiety shifts the entire tone of the conversation, signaling that the decision is being weighed carefully rather than desperately welcomed. And this shift alone often results in improved terms, not because anything factual has changed but because the perceived value of the candidate has shifted in the employer's mind simply through the presence of patience where reflexive acceptance was expected. This same logic applies to how professionals handle competitive information within an industry. There is often a temptation, particularly early in a career, to share everything you know, every insight, every connection, every advantage you have discovered as a way of demonstrating value and building goodwill quickly. But those who rise into positions of genuine strategic influence tend to develop a more selective approach over time, understanding that not every piece of useful information needs to be broadcast the moment it is discovered. This is not about hoarding knowledge out of pettiness. It is about recognizing that timing and context determine the value of information just as much as its content does. Sharing an insight with the right person at the right moment in service of a genuine relationship tends to build far more durable trust and leverage than scattering the same insight indiscriminately to anyone who happens to be listening, where its impact is diluted and its origin quickly forgotten. The professionals who are consistently sought out for advice and partnership are rarely the ones who talk the most about what they know. They are the ones whose occasional well-placed contributions have taught others that listening to them when they do choose to speak reliably pays off. Chapter 7. Strategic Silence in Relationships and Conflict. Personal relationships operate under different rules than boardrooms, but the underlying dynamics of silence and restraint remain remarkably consistent, sometimes even more powerful because emotional stakes tend to amplify every communication pattern rather than diminish them. Consider the anatomy of a typical argument between two people who care about each other. One person raises a grievance and the other, feeling defensive, immediately begins constructing a rebuttal before the first person has even finished speaking. Neither person is truly listening at this point. They are both simply waiting for their turn to talk, and the conversation quickly devolves into two parallel monologues rather than an actual exchange. This pattern, so common that most people barely notice they are participating in it, is precisely where strategic silence offers its greatest relational value. When one party breaks this pattern, by fully listening, allowing a genuine pause after the other person finishes and only then responding, something shifts almost immediately in the emotional temperature of the conversation. The person who was upset often feels for perhaps the first time in the exchange that they have actually been heard. And this alone frequently de-escalates a conflict more effectively than any well-constructed counterargument could. This does not mean staying silent about your own needs or grievances indefinitely. That would tip into an entirely different unhealthy pattern, which we will address directly in the next chapter. What it means is recognizing that the immediate reactive response, the one fired off the instant you feel criticized or hurt, is rarely your best response. And that a brief pause, even just a few seconds of genuine consideration before speaking, tends to produce words that repair rather than escalate. There is also a particular kind of relational power that comes from not needing to have the last word in every disagreement. Many conflicts are prolonged not because there is genuinely more to resolve, but because one or both parties feel an emotional compulsion to ensure their perspective was the final one, stated as though the conversation is a competition that must be won rather than a relationship that must be maintained. Letting go of this compulsion, allowing a disagreement to end without you delivering the final rebuttal, can feel deeply uncomfortable at first, almost like conceding something important. But over time, people who practice this consistently often find that their relationships carry far less residual tension because fewer arguments spiral into extended, exhausting exchanges where both people are simply trying to outlast the other verbally rather than actually resolve anything. Silence also plays a crucial role in moments of emotional support, distinct from conflict entirely. When someone close to you is going through something difficult, the instinct to fill silence with advice, reassurance, or attempts to fix the situation, however well-intentioned, can sometimes communicate the opposite of what you intend, that their pain needs to be resolved quickly rather than simply witnessed. Sitting with someone in silence, offering your full attention without rushing to solve or explain, is frequently far more comforting than any well-meaning speech because it communicates something words often cannot. That you are willing to stay present in the discomfort with them rather than needing to talk your way out of it. This is one of the most misunderstood applications of strategic silence, that it is not only a tool for gaining advantage. It is also, in the right moments, an act of genuine care, a way of honoring another person's experience without immediately turning it into something that must be managed or resolved through words. Consider also how strategic patience shapes the earliest stages of a relationship long before any conflict has even had the chance to arise. People who reveal every thought, every insecurity, every detail of their history within the first few conversations often unintentionally collapse. The sense of mystery and discovery that healthy relationships depend on to develop naturally over time. This is not a suggestion to be guarded or dishonest, but rather a recognition that emotional intimacy, much like trust in any other context, tends to mean more when it is built gradually through a series of chosen moments of vulnerability rather than delivered all at once out of nervous excitement or a desire to accelerate closeness. Relationships that develop with this kind of patience, where each person reveals themselves a little at a time, matching the pace of genuine trust as it actually builds, tend to develop a more durable foundation than relationships that rush toward tea before either person has actually earned the other's trust through consistent behavior over time. There is a similar pattern in how people navigate disagreements with family members, where decades of established roles and expectations can make silence feel almost impossible to maintain. A grown child who has spent years feeling compelled to justify every decision to a parent. Or a sibling who feels pressure to immediately defend themselves against every old family narrative often finds that the simple act of pausing, of not immediately explaining or defending, gradually shifts the entire dynamic of these long-standing relationships, because it interrupts a pattern that both parties may have unconsciously participated in for years without ever questioning why the escalation kept happening in exactly the same way every single time. There is also a specific application of strategic silence that deserves attention. The practice of not immediately responding to a partner's or friend's bad mood, irritability, or emotional withdrawal with anxious questioning or attempts to fix things right away. Many people out of genuine care feel an almost immediate pull to ask what is wrong the moment they sense a shift in someone close to them. But this instinct, however loving in intention, can sometimes have the unintended effect of pressuring the other person to explain themselves before they are actually ready, or before they have even fully processed what they are feeling internally. Allowing space, giving someone the quiet room to come to you when they are ready, rather than pursuing an explanation the moment discomfort is sensed, often communicates a deeper form of trust and respect than immediate intervention does, signaling that you believe the other person is capable of managing their own internal experience and will share it with you on their own timeline, rather than needing to be extracted from it through persistent questioning. This same principle of patient restraint extends to how people handle their own difficult emotions within a relationship. Resisting the urge to immediately vent every frustration the moment it arises, and instead allowing a genuine feeling to settle enough to be expressed clearly and constructively rather than as a raw, unfiltered reaction. That often causes more relational damage than the original frustration ever warranted. Chapter 8. The difference between silence and avoidance. Everything discussed so far could, if misunderstood, be twisted into a justification for something quite different and considerably less healthy. Using silence as a shield against accountability, or patience as an excuse for inaction. It is essential to draw a clear line here, because the difference between strategic silence and avoidance is not always obvious from the outside, but it is entirely obvious from the inside if you are honest with yourself about your own motivations. Strategic silence is chosen from a position of security. It is the decision not to speak because speaking would not serve the moment, made by someone who is fully capable of speaking clearly and directly when the situation actually calls for it. Avoidance, by contrast, is silence chosen from a position of fear. It is the refusal to address a difficult conversation, a necessary boundary, or an overdue confrontation. Not because the timing is wrong, but because the discomfort of engaging feels unbearable. These two behaviors can look almost identical from the outside. Both involve someone staying quiet, but their internal source and their consequences are entirely different. A person practicing strategic silence in a relationship might choose not to respond in the heat of an argument, planning instead to revisit the conversation calmly once emotions have settled and they follow through on that intention. A person practicing avoidance might use the exact same justification, telling themselves they will address it later, but that later never actually arrives. And the unresolved issue simply accumulates beneath the surface, quietly damaging the relationship in ways that eventually surface as resentment, distance, or a sudden disproportionate eruption. When the accumulated silence finally becomes unsustainable, the test for distinguishing between the two is not how long the silence lasts, but whether it is genuinely purposeful or whether it is functioning as an escape. Ask yourself honestly in any given moment of restraint, Am I staying quiet because speaking now would be strategically unwise, or am I staying quiet because I am afraid of what speaking might require of me? The first answer reflects discipline. The second reflects fear wearing the costume of discipline. And it is remarkably easy to convince yourself that fear is actually strategy, because both produce the same outward behavior in the moment. This distinction matters enormously because unresolved avoidance rarely stays contained. It tends to leak out sideways through passive aggression, through subtle withdrawal, through resentment that has no clear outlet. Because it was never directly voiced in the first place. Genuine strategic silence, by contrast, is almost always accompanied by a clear internal plan. A recognition that the difficult conversation will happen, just not in this particular moment under these particular emotional conditions. This is why patience properly understood is not the same as procrastination. Patience means waiting for the right moment to act with full intention of acting when that moment arrives. Procrastination dressed up as patience means waiting indefinitely, hoping the need to act will simply dissolve on its own, which it very rarely does. There is also an important distinction to draw around boundaries specifically, because this is where the confusion between silence and avoidance tends to cause the most damage in people's lives. Choosing not to engage with every provocation, every minor conflict, every attempt to pull you into unnecessary drama is a healthy application of strategic silence. Choosing to stay silent about a genuine violation of your boundaries out of fear of the other person's reaction is not strategic at all. It is simply self-abandonment, wearing a more sophisticated disguise. The people who use silence most effectively throughout their lives are not the people who avoid every difficult conversation. They are the people who have simply learned to choose their moments with precision, refusing to be pulled into unnecessary conflict while remaining entirely willing and able to speak directly, firmly and clearly when something genuinely requires it. There is a practical way to check yourself against this distinction whenever you notice a pattern of prolonged silence in your own life, and it involves examining the physical and emotional sensation that accompanies it. Strategic silence, even when it involves some discomfort, tends to carry an underlying sense of calm and control. A quiet confidence that the moment for speaking will come and that you are simply choosing not to rush it. Avoidance, by contrast, tends to carry a very different underlying sensation. A low-grade dread, a persistent awareness in the back of your mind that something is being left unrest, accompanied by a subtle but constant drain on your mental energy because unresolved issues, even unspoken ones, continue to occupy attention in the background. Whether you consciously acknowledge them or not. Learning to notice this difference in bodily sensation rather than relying purely on rationalized explanations for your own silence can be one of the most reliable ways to catch yourself drifting from discipline into avoidance before the gap between the two becomes too costly to repair easily. It is also worth noting that avoidance often masquerades as maturity, particularly in cultures or families that place a high value on keeping the peace at almost any cost. Someone raised in an environment where conflict was treated as inherently dangerous or shameful may have learned quite early in life to equate silence with virtue, regardless of whether that silence was actually serving anyone. Unlearning this pattern requires distinguishing between the silence that was taught to you as a survival strategy in childhood, often necessary at the time, and the silence you are choosing now as an adult with genuine agency over when and how you engage. The goal is never to eliminate every instinct toward restraint. Many of those instincts remain valuable, but rather to bring conscious awareness to the choice itself so that silence becomes something you are actively selecting for strategic reasons rather than something you default into simply because speaking still feels on some old and unexamined level unsafe. A useful way to further clarify this distinction is to consider the eventual outcome each pattern tends to produce. Because outcomes reveal intention more reliably than intentions alone ever can. Strategic silence practiced consistently over time tends to produce relationships and situations that gradually improve because the necessary conversations do eventually happen just on a more considered timeline and the underlying issues get addressed rather than simply postponed indefinitely. Avoidance practiced consistently over time tends to produce the opposite trajectory. Relationships and situations that gradually deteriorate. Not through any single dramatic event, but through the slow accumulation of things left unsaid, boundaries left unenforced, and needs left unexpressed until the gap between how a situation appears on the surface and how it actually feels underneath becomes wide enough that something eventually has to give. Often in a far more disruptive way than an honest, well-timed conversation would have required months or years earlier. If you find yourself uncertain which pattern you are actually engaged in, looking honestly at the trajectory of the situation itself, is it genuinely improving? Or is it simply being held in a fragile, unaddressed suspension? Often provides a far more reliable answer than examining your intentions alone. Because intentions, however sincere, are remarkably easy to misread when fear is quietly doing the deciding. Chapter 9. Patience has a compounding advantage. If silence is the discipline of withholding words until they matter, patience is its broader companion, the discipline of withholding action, judgment and reaction until timing actually favors you. And much like compound interest quietly transforms small, consistent financial decisions into significant long-term wealth, patience quietly transforms small, consistent moments of restraint into significant long-term advantage in ways that are often invisible in any single moment, but become undeniable when viewed across months or years. One of the clearest illustrations of this comes from research on delayed gratification, most famously associated with studies observing how children handled the challenge of resisting an immediate small reward in favor of a larger reward later. What made these studies so enduring in public memory was not simply the finding that some children could wait longer than others, but the striking correlation between that early capacity for patience and a wide range of favorable outcomes measured many years later, including academic performance, emotional resilience, and social functioning. The exact mechanisms behind this correlation have been debated and refined over the years, but the broader pattern it points to remains instructive. The ability to tolerate short-term discomfort in service of a longer-term goal appears to be one of the most consistently valuable traits a person can develop, showing up again and again across very different domains of life. In practical terms, patience compounds because it changes the quality of every decision it touches. A patient investor willing to tolerate short-term volatility without panic selling consistently outperforms a reactive investor who buys and sells based on momentary fear or excitement. Not because the patient investor is smarter, but because patience itself filters out the impulsive decisions that erode returns over time. A patient professional willing to build skills and relationships steadily over years rather than chasing every shortcut or shiny opportunity tends to end up in a stronger position than someone who is constantly reactive, jumping toward whatever seems most urgent or exciting in the moment. Because steady, unglamorous consistency simply accumulates results that impulsive urgency rarely matches. A patient communicator willing to wait for the right moment to raise a difficult topic rather than blurting it out the instant it crosses their mind tends to be heard more clearly and taken more seriously than someone who raises every concern the moment it occurs to them, regardless of context or timing. In each of these examples, patience is not passive. It is an active filtering mechanism screening out the impulsive, poorly timed actions that would otherwise dilute the effectiveness of everything else a person does. This is precisely why patience compounds rather than simply accumulates. Each patient decision does not just avoid one bad outcome. It also strengthens the habit of patience itself, making the next moment of restraint slightly easier to access, which in turn improves the next decision and the next. In a gradually reinforcing cycle over enough time, this cycle produces a kind of quiet structural advantage that is difficult for purely reactive people to compete with. Not because reactive people lack intelligence or effort, but because their decisions are constantly being degraded by poor timing, impulsive reversals and reactions driven by momentary emotion rather than considered judgment. Patience in this light is not simply a pleasant personality trait. It is closer to a compounding multiplier applied across every other skill and decision in a person's life, quietly increasing the return on everything it touches. It is worth addressing directly why patience feels so difficult to sustain in the modern world, specifically because understanding the forces working against it makes the practice considerably easier to maintain deliberately. Much of contemporary life is engineered, often quite intentionally, to reward immediacy over patience. Instant messages expect instant replies. Content is designed to be consumed in seconds rather than considered over days. Financial markets provide moment-to-moment price updates that invite constant reaction rather than steady long-term thinking. Every one of these systems trains the nervous system toward shorter and shorter attention spans and toward an expectation that gratification, whether informational, social, or financial, should arrive almost instantly, recognizing that this environment is actively working against your capacity for patience. Rather than assuming that impatience is simply your personal failing, can be surprisingly freeing because it reframes the practice of patience not as a character flaw you need to fix but as a skill you need to consciously protect against a world that is constantly pulling you away from it. This is why many of the most patient, strategically minded people deliberately build friction into their own lives, choosing not to check markets constantly, not to respond to messages the instant they arrive, not to make major decisions in the heat of an emotional moment, precisely because they understand that the ease of instant reaction is not a neutral convenience. It is a constant low-grade pull toward exactly the kind of impulsive decision-making that patience is designed to protect against. Building these small pockets of deliberate delay into daily life, even artificially at first, gradually restores a capacity that the modern environment tends to erode until patience once again becomes something closer to a natural, comfortable default rather than a constant uphill effort against every notification, deadline, and flashing indicator competing for an instant reaction. It is also worth recognizing that patience, unlike many other virtues commonly discussed in personal development, tends to be almost invisible from the outside while it is being practiced. Nobody applauds you for the argument you did not escalate, the purchase you did not impulsively make, or the message you waited a day to send. This invisibility is precisely what makes patience so difficult to sustain without a genuine internal understanding of its value, because there is rarely any immediate external reward for choosing it. The reward, when it comes, tends to arrive much later and often in a form disconnected enough from the original moment of restraint that most people never consciously connect the two. The relationship that did not implode because you waited to respond calmly. The financial position that grew steadily because you did not panic during a downturn. The reputation that grew stronger because you let a false rumor pass without dignifying it with a reaction. None of these outcomes announce themselves as the direct result of a specific moment of patience, which is exactly why patience remains one of the most underrated and underpracticed disciplines available to anyone willing to genuinely commit to it. Quietly compounding in the background while louder, more immediately gratifying strategies compete for attention and ultimately produce far less durable results. Chapter 10. How Oversharing and Reactivity Signal Low Status. There is a particular social cost to oversharing and constant reactivity that most people never fully register because the feedback is rarely direct. Nobody typically tells you outright that speaking too much, too quickly, or too emotionally is costing you credibility. But the perception forms anyway, quietly in the minds of everyone observing the pattern over time. Understanding exactly how this perception forms gives you a significant advantage because it allows you to recognize the subtle social signals that most people send without ever intending to. Oversharing in this context does not simply mean revealing too much personal information. Though that is part of it, it also includes explaining yourself excessively, justifying decisions that did not require justification, and offering unsolicited details about your reasoning, your uncertainty, or your emotional state in situations that called for a simple, confident statement instead. Each of these behaviors, though often well-intentioned, tends to signal something the speaker rarely means to communicate. A need for external validation or reassurance. When someone explains a decision at great length unprompted, it can unintentionally suggest they are not fully confident in that decision themselves and are seeking the listener's approval, even if only unconsciously. Compare this to how people in positions of genuine confidence and authority tend to communicate. They state decisions plainly without excessive justification, trusting that the decision itself carries sufficient weight without needing to be defended preemptively. This does not mean they never explain their reasoning, but they do so selectively when it genuinely serves the listener's understanding rather than compulsively as a way of managing their own internal uncertainty. Reactivity operates on a similar principle. When someone responds immediately and emotionally to every piece of criticism, every disagreement, every minor provocation, it signals, whether intended or not, that they do not have full control over their own internal state. That external events are able to immediately dictate their emotional and verbal responses. This is precisely why calm, measured responses to provocation are so consistently associated with perceived strength across cultures and contexts. They demonstrate that the person's internal state is not simply at the mercy of whatever happens to them in any given moment. There is a particularly interesting social phenomenon worth noting here. The way status is frequently inferred not from what someone says but from how quickly and how emotionally they feel compelled to respond. In many social hierarchies, whether in a family, a friend group, or a professional organization, it is often the person with the least established status who feels the greatest pressure to react immediately to every slight, every disagreement, every perceived challenge because they have not yet developed the security that comes with an established position. Meanwhile, those with more secure standing can often afford to let minor provocations pass without comment entirely. Not because they did not notice them, but because responding to every minor challenge simply is not worth the expenditure of their attention or credibility. This creates a subtle but observable pattern where the willingness to let things go, to respond selectively rather than constantly itself becomes a signal of status regardless of a person's actual formal position. Learning to recognize this pattern clears you to consciously adjust your own behavior, choosing your battles deliberately rather than reactively. And in doing so, gradually shifting how others perceive your standing. Not through any single dramatic action, but through the slow, consistent accumulation of moments where you demonstrated through restraint rather than reaction that you did not need to respond to everything in order to remain unaffected by it. It is worth noting finally that this dynamic tends to be especially pronounced on social media and in digital communication more broadly, where the sheer ease of responding instantly has removed almost every natural barrier that once slowed reactive communication down. In earlier eras, disagreements required time, a letter, a phone call, a face-to-face conversation, and that built-in delay often served as an accidental filter, giving the initial emotional reaction time to fade before a response was actually delivered. Digital platforms removed that filter almost entirely, allowing reaction to travel from impulse to publication in seconds. And the result has been an environment where reactivity is not just common but actively rewarded through engagement. Where the most emotionally charged immediate responses are often the ones that receive the most visibility and attention. This creates a strange inversion of the pattern we have been describing throughout this chapter. An environment that structurally incentivizes exactly the behavior most associated with lower perceived status in other contexts. Recognizing this inversion allows you to make a deliberate choice about how you want to participate in these spaces. Understanding that the instinct to respond immediately to every online provocation is being actively engineered by the platform itself. Not simply arising naturally from the situation, choosing restraint in these spaces, declining to respond instantly, sometimes declining to respond at all, or waiting a considerable amount of time before engaging with something that provoked a strong reaction. Often runs directly against the design of the environment, which makes it all the more valuable as a demonstration of genuine self-control, precisely because it requires resisting a system built specifically to prevent it. There is one final observation worth making about status and reactivity. One that ties this chapter back to everything discussed earlier in this journey. Through silence and patience, the people who are perceived as having the most control, the most quiet confidence, the most genuine strength in almost any setting are rarely the people working the hardest to prove those qualities through their words. They are the people whose behavior over time has simply demonstrated those qualities so consistently that proving them through speech has become unnecessary. This is the deepest form of the advantage we have been exploring throughout this chapter. That restraint practiced honestly and consistently eventually stops requiring conscious effort and starts functioning as an accurate reflection of who you have actually become. Someone who does not need every provocation answered, every silence filled, or every piece of information shared, because their sense of worth was never dependent on constant external proof in the first place. Chapter 11. Reading the Room. Knowing when to speak and when to hold back. Everything we have explored so far could be misread as an argument for permanent silence. For becoming someone who never speaks first, never volunteers an opinion, never fills a pause. That would be a serious misunderstanding of what strategic silence actually is. The skill is not silence itself. The skill is discernment, the ability to accurately read a given moment and determine whether speaking or withholding will actually serve your goals, your relationships, and your long-term standing. Silence used indiscriminately becomes just as costly as speech used indiscriminately. Because a person who never contributes, never shares an opinion, never steps forward when a moment genuinely calls for their voice, eventually becomes invisible in an entirely different, more damaging way. Mistaken for having nothing to offer rather than having chosen restraint deliberately, learning to read a room accurately requires paying attention to several distinct signals simultaneously. The first is the actual stakes of the moment. Not every conversation, every meeting, every disagreement carries equal weight. And part of strategic communication is recognizing which moments genuinely require your full engagement and which ones are simply noise unworthy of the energy and information cost that speaking always carries. A minor disagreement over an unimportant detail rarely justifies extended argument, while a genuine ethical concern, a significant misunderstanding, or a moment that will shape a relationship or a decision for years to come absolutely does justify stepping forward clearly and directly. The second signal worth reading is the emotional temperature of the room itself. Highly charged, emotionally reactive environments are rarely the moments where careful, nuanced points land well, regardless of how correct or valuable those points might be. Waiting for emotional intensity to settle before contributing a complex or sensitive perspective often means that perspective is actually heard rather than lost entirely in the noise of a moment where everyone present is too activated to genuinely absorb new information. The third signal is your own internal state, which deserves just as much attention as the external room. Speaking from a place of genuine clarity produces very different results than speaking from a place of anxiety, defensiveness, or the simple discomfort of an unfilled pause before contributing to any conversation that matters. It is worth taking a brief internal inventory. Am I about to say this because it genuinely needs to be said, or because I am uncomfortable with the silence that preceded this moment? This distinction alone filters out an enormous amount of unnecessary speech, leaving only the contributions that actually carry weight. There is also real value in developing what might be called situational fluency. The ability to recognize recurring patterns across different types of interactions and calibrate your response accordingly. A negotiation calls for a different balance of speech and silence than a close friendship in crisis. A public professional setting calls for a different calibration than a private, informal gathering among people who already trust you deeply. Part of genuine social intelligence is recognizing that the right ratio of speaking to withholding is not fixed. It shifts depending on context, relationship, and stakes. And the people who navigate this most skillfully are not simply quiet people. They are people who have developed an accurate, almost intuitive sense of which mode a given moment actually calls for. This intuition is not innate. It is built through attentive observation over time. Paying close attention to which moments of speech and which moments of silence produced outcomes you were genuinely satisfied with, and gradually refining your instincts based on that accumulated experience rather than defaulting rigidly to either extreme regardless of what any particular situation actually requires. There is a particular category of moment worth examining separately because it trips up even people who have otherwise developed strong instincts around strategic silence. And that is the moment when someone directly asks for your opinion. In these situations, Silence is rarely the right response because withholding when genuinely invited to contribute can read as evasiveness, disengagement, or a lack of confidence rather than strategic restraint. The skill here is not silence itself, but precision. Learning to answer directly, ask questions clearly and concisely without using the invitation as an opportunity to overexplain, hedge excessively, or bury a simple answer beneath unnecessary qualification. A person who has genuinely mastered strategic communication does not disappear when called upon. They simply avoid inserting themselves into moments where their input was neither needed nor requested. There is also a meaningful difference between staying quiet in a group setting where your silence is essentially invisible among many other voices and staying quiet in a one-on-one conversation where silence carries far more weight and is far more noticeable to the other person. Reading the room accurately means recognizing that the same behavior, silence, can communicate entirely different things depending on this structural context. Thoughtful restraint in one setting and something closer to disengagement or evasiveness in another. Developing genuine fluency in this skill ultimately means holding two things simultaneously without contradiction. A strong disciplined default toward restraint and an equally strong willingness to step forward clearly and fully the moment a situation genuinely calls for your voice without hesitation or unnecessary hedging once that moment has actually arrived. There is one more dimension of reading the room worth exploring. The way cultural and organizational context shapes what strategic silence actually looks like in practice. Different environments carry different unspoken expectations around communication style, and a pattern of restraint that reads as confident and measured in one setting might read as disengaged or unhelpful in another. Some professional cultures reward frequent visible contribution as a marker of engagement where even a strong instinct towards selective speech needs to be calibrated against the practical reality that complete silence in certain meetings could genuinely be misread as a lack of investment in the work. Other environments, often those with more established hierarchies or more formal communication norms, treat frequent unsolicited commentary as a sign of poor judgment, where restraint is far more likely to be read correctly as thoughtful discretion. Part of genuine social intelligence involves accurately reading which type of environment you are operating within at any given time rather than applying a single fixed communication style universally across every context you encounter. This does not mean abandoning the core discipline of restraint. It means applying it with enough flexibility to remain effective across different settings. Adjusting the specific threshold for when speech is warranted while maintaining the underlying commitment to speaking with intention rather than reflex. A useful practice here involves observing early in any new environment or relationship how the most respected people within it actually communicate. Not what they claim to value, but what their actual behavior reveals about the unspoken rules governing speech and silence in that particular context. And calibrating your own approach accordingly while never abandoning the deeper principle that words spent carelessly are words that lose their value over time, regardless of which specific environment you happen to be operating within. Chapter 12. Building your own discipline of restraint. Understanding the value of strategic silence and patience intellectually is only the first step. The far more difficult work lies in actually building this discipline into your daily behavior until it becomes second nature rather than a constant effortful override of your natural impulses. This transformation does not happen through a single decision. It happens through the accumulation of many small deliberate practices repeated consistently over time. The first practice worth establishing is what might be called the mandatory pause. A simple non-negotiable rule that before responding to anything that triggers a strong emotional reaction, whether a criticism, a provocation, or a difficult piece of news, you allow a fixed amount of time to pass before crafting your response. This can be as short as counting to 10 in a live conversation or as long as sleeping on a decision overnight before sending a written response. The specific duration matters less than the consistency of the practice itself because the goal is not to eliminate your initial reaction but to prevent that initial reaction from being the one that actually gets expressed. The second practice involves deliberately auditing your own speech patterns, paying attention, perhaps even briefly noting to yourself how often you speak simply to fill an uncomfortable silence rather than because you have something genuinely necessary to contribute. Many people, once they begin paying honest attention to this pattern, are startled by how frequently they speak purely out of discomfort with quiet rather than out of any genuine communicative necessity. Simply becoming aware of this pattern without judgment begins to create the internal space needed to choose differently in future moments. The third practice is learning to sit with silence deliberately in low-stakes situations as a form of practice for the higher-stakes moments where it will matter more. This might mean allowing a natural pause in a casual conversation to stretch slightly longer than usual without rushing to fill it, or spending time in genuinely quiet environments without immediately reaching for a distraction to fill the discomfort. Like any skill, tolerance for silence improves with exposure, and practicing it in low-stakes moments builds the capacity to access it more easily when the stakes are considerably higher. The fourth practice involves preparing in advance for situations you know will tempt you toward reactive speech. If you know a particular conversation, a particular person, or a particular type of situation reliably triggers an impulsive response in you, spend time beforehand considering how you want to handle it, what your actual goals are in that interaction, and what a measured strategic response might look like, rather than waiting until you are already in the emotionally activated moment to figure this out. For the first time, this kind of preparation dramatically increases your ability to maintain restraint when it actually counts, because you are not trying to access clear thinking for the first time under pressure. You are simply executing a plan you already considered calmly in advance. The fifth and perhaps most important practice is self-compassion. When this discipline inevitably fails, because it will, particularly in the beginning. Every person working to build this skill will have moments where they speak too quickly, react too strongly, or feel a silence they wished in hindsight they had allowed to remain. These moments are not evidence that the practice does not work. They are simply part of the process of building any new skill. And treating them as valuable information rather than personal failures makes it far more likely that the practice will actually stick over the long term, rather than being abandoned in a moment of frustrated self-criticism after an inevitable slip. A sixth practice worth incorporating into this discipline involves deliberately tracking your progress over time. Not through rigid metrics, but through simple, honest reflection at the end of each week or month, noting moments where restraint served you well, moments where you slipped into old reactive patterns, and any patterns you notice emerging across these observations. This kind of reflection accomplishes two important things simultaneously. It reinforces the value of the practice by making its benefits visible and concrete rather than abstract. And it helps identify specific triggers or contexts where your discipline tends to break down most consistently, allowing you to direct extra preparation and attention toward exactly those recurring situations. A seventh practice, often overlooked, involves surrounding yourself where possible with others who model this same discipline. Behavior is contagious in ways that are easy to underestimate, and spending significant time around people who are reactive, impulsive, and constantly filling every silence with unnecessary speech makes it considerably harder to maintain your own restraint simply through the pull of social mirroring. Conversely, spending time around people who demonstrate genuine patience and thoughtful restraint tends to reinforce your own practice almost effortlessly. Because the calm, measured pace of their communication becomes a kind of ambient standard that your own behavior naturally begins to match. None of these practices need to be adopted all at once. In fact, attempting to overhaul every aspect of your communication style simultaneously often backfires, producing exactly the kind of overwhelm that makes any new discipline difficult to sustain. A more effective approach involves choosing one practice, perhaps the mandatory pause, and committing to it consistently for several weeks before layering in additional practices, allowing each new habit to become genuinely stable before adding the next. So that the overall discipline builds gradually on a solid foundation rather than being rushed into existence and abandoned at the first sign of difficulty. It is also worth addressing how this discipline applies specifically to written communication, which carries its own unique challenges and opportunities compared to spoken conversation. Written messages, whether emails, texts, or other digital communication, offer a distinct advantage that live conversation does not: the built-in opportunity to draft a response and revisit it before sending. And yet, this advantage is remarkably underused by most people, who often type and send a reactive message within seconds of reading whatever prompted it. A simple but highly effective practice involves drafting any emotionally charged written response, then deliberately closing the message without sending it. Returning to it only after a meaningful period of time has passed, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, occasionally even a full day for particularly significant matters. In the vast majority of cases, the message you eventually do send after this pause differs considerably from the one you would have sent immediately. Often shorter, calmer, and more precisely targeted at what actually needs to be communicated rather than everything your initial emotional reaction wanted to express. This practice costs almost nothing in terms of effort, and yet it prevents an enormous amount of the relational and professional damage that comes from reactive written communication, which carries the particular danger of being permanent, easily forwarded, and impossible to fully retract once sent, unlike a spoken comment that fades from memory and lacks a permanent record. Building this specific habit around written communication, treating the send button as a genuine decision point rather than an automatic conclusion to the drafting process, is one of the most practical, immediately applicable versions of everything this chapter has explored, and one that tends to produce visible results remarkably quickly once genuinely adopted as a consistent practice. Chapter 13. Moments of Silence That Changed Everything. Abstract principles become far more memorable and more usable when grounded in specific concrete moments. And the history of strategic silence offers countless examples worth holding on to, not as rigid formulas to copy, but as illustrations of the underlying pattern in action. Consider a common scenario that plays out in high-stakes salary negotiations. One that career counselors and negotiation experts return to again and again because of how consistently it produces results. A candidate receives an initial offer that falls short of their expectations. The instinct many people follow in this moment is to immediately counter, to explain why they deserve more. Sometimes even to apologize for asking. But those trained in negotiation frequently describe a different approach, simply stating calmly that they need to think about it and then allowing genuine silence to follow, resisting the urge to fill the pause with justification or reassurance. In a striking number of documented cases, this pause alone prompts the employer to improve the offer without any further negotiation at all, because the silence itself communicates a seriousness and self-possession that active bargaining sometimes fails to convey. Consider also the pattern that frequently emerges in mediated disputes. Whether in business partnerships dissolving or family conflicts reaching a breaking point, mediators often observe that the party who speaks the least during the actual mediation session, who listens fully, asks clarifying questions rather than immediately arguing their position, and allows the other party's grievances to be fully expressed without interruption, frequently ends up in a stronger position by the end of the process. Not because they conceded more, but because their restraint created space for the other party to reveal information, motivations, and flexibility that a more combative approach would have kept hidden. There is also a pattern worth examining in how public figures navigate controversy, particularly false or exaggerated accusations that spread quickly through media or public discourse. The instinct to respond immediately, to correct every inaccuracy the moment it appears, is powerful and understandable. But a considerable body of observation suggests that this instinct often backfires, extending the life of a story that would otherwise have faded on its own and lending it a credibility through the very act of engaging with it that it might not have earned through the strength of its original claims. Public figures who choose instead to let a controversy run its course without immediate engagement, responding only once later with a single clear statement if a response becomes genuinely necessary at all, frequently find that the controversy fades from public attention far faster than it would have if actively fed through constant rebuttal. This pattern is uncomfortable to trust in the moment because it requires tolerating public criticism without the immediate relief of defending yourself. But it consistently produces better long-term outcomes than the alternative. Perhaps the most relatable version of this pattern shows up in ordinary workplace disputes, the kind almost everyone has experienced at some point in their career. A colleague takes credit for your work in a meeting or makes a comment that undermines you in front of others. The immediate emotional impulse is to correct the record right there publicly in the heat of the moment. But those who have learned to read these situations strategically often choose a different path, allowing the moment to pass without visible reaction and instead addressing it directly and privately with the colleague afterward or raising it thoughtfully with a supervisor. Once emotions have settled and the conversation can focus on facts rather than defensive posturing. This approach frequently produces a far better outcome than a public confrontation would have. Both because it avoids the appearance of pettiness or overreaction in front of others and because it gives the other party a genuine opportunity to correct their behavior without the added complication of public embarrassment, which often makes people defensive rather than accountable. Another illustrative pattern appears in how skilled interviewers, whether journalists, investigators, or hiring managers, extract far more revealing information from the people they speak with than less experienced interviewers typically manage. The technique at the heart of this skill is almost disarmingly simple. Ask a question and then once the initial answer has been given simply remain silent rather than immediately following up with another question. Most people uncomfortable with the silence that follows their initial response instinctively continue talking, often revealing additional details, context or honest reactions they had not originally intended to share simply because the silence created a kind of implicit invitation to keep filling the space. Skilled interviewers understand this dynamic deeply and use it deliberately, resisting their own urge to move the conversation along quickly because they know that the most valuable information often emerges not from the first answer given but from what a person says next, unprompted into an uncomfortable silence they felt compelled to fill. This same technique used with awareness rather than manipulation can be valuable in far more ordinary settings as well, allowing a friend, partner, or colleague the space to continue speaking after their first response. Rather than immediately jumping in with your own reaction or the next question often reveals a depth of thought and feeling that a faster-paced, more reactive conversation would have missed entirely. Consider finally the pattern that shows up in how respected leaders handle moments of dissent within their own teams. When a team member raises a challenging, unwelcome perspective in a meeting, the instinct for many leaders is to respond immediately, whether to defend the original decision, to explain the reasoning behind it, or to gently redirect the conversation elsewhere. Leaders who are able to simply pause, genuinely consider the challenge before responding, and sometimes even acknowledge that they need time to think it over before answering tend to build considerably more trust and psychological safety within their teams than leaders who feel compelled to have an immediate polished response to every challenge raised. Because that pause itself communicates something valuable, that the concern was taken seriously enough to warrant genuine consideration rather than a reflexive defensive reply. One final case worth examining involves a pattern that plays out repeatedly in long-term friendships and family relationships where a single moment of restrained silence rather than an immediate defensive reaction has been credited with preserving relationships that might otherwise have fractured permanently over a single heated exchange. Consider the common scenario where a friend or family member says something genuinely hurtful, whether intentionally or in a moment of their own stress and frustration. The natural impulse is to respond immediately, matching the intensity of what was said, often escalating a single unkind comment into a much larger conflict that neither person actually wanted. Those who have learned to trust the value of a pause in these moments often describe a different experience entirely, choosing to step away briefly, sometimes literally leaving the room for a few minutes before returning to address what was said. And finding that the conversation that eventually follows is considerably calmer and more productive than the one that would have unfolded in the heat of the original moment. This single choice, so simple in principle yet so difficult to execute in the actual emotional intensity of the moment, has been the deciding factor in countless relationships that endured rather than fractured. Precisely because the space created by that brief silence gave both parties the chance to move past their initial defensive reaction and engage instead with what was actually being communicated beneath the hurtful words. Whether that was genuine malice or simply exhaustion, stress or fear expressed clumsily in a moment neither person was fully prepared for. Chapter 14. The quiet confidence that commands respect. There is a particular quality that people who have genuinely mastered strategic silence and patience tend to share. Something observers often struggle to name precisely but recognize immediately when they encounter it. It is sometimes described as gravitas, sometimes as presence, sometimes simply as the sense that a person is comfortable in their own skin in a way that most people are not. This quality is not the product of any single technique described throughout this journey. It is the cumulative result of consistently practicing restraint until it becomes an authentic expression of genuine internal security rather than a performance layered on top of underlying anxiety. This distinction matters enormously because attempting to project calm confidence while internally remaining reactive and anxious tends to produce something that reads, even if only subconsciously, as slightly off to observers. A performance rather than a genuine state. True quiet confidence cannot be faked convincingly for long because it depends on an actual internal shift, a genuine reduction in the need for external validation, immediate resolution of every tension, and constant verbal proof of one's own value or correctness. This internal shift tends to develop gradually as the practices described throughout this exploration accumulate into lived experience each time you successfully sit with an uncomfortable silence rather than rushing to fill it. And observe that nothing catastrophic resulted from that restraint. Your nervous system updates its expectations slightly, becoming a little more comfortable with silence the next time. Each time you withhold a reactive response and later feel grateful that you did because the measured response you gave instead produced a better outcome, your brain reinforces the value of that pattern, making it easier to access in the future. Over enough repetitions, this is no longer effortful discipline. It becomes simply who you are. A person who does not need to fill every silence. Who does not need the last word in every disagreement. Who can tolerate uncertainty and tension without immediately needing to resolve it through speech or action. This is precisely the quality that others read as quiet confidence, and it commands a particular kind of respect that loud constant self-assertion rarely manages to earn because it does not ask to be believed. It simply is consistently observably over time. There is an important nuance here worth sitting with, that this quiet confidence is not about withholding warmth, humor or genuine engagement with others. Some of the most quietly confident people are also deeply warm, quick to laugh, genuinely present in conversation. The restraint we have been discussing throughout this exploration is specific. It applies to reactive, anxious, validation-seeking speech, not to genuine connection, humor, or engagement. In fact, the two often reinforce each other beautifully because a person who is not constantly managing their own internal anxiety through speech has considerably more genuine attention available to offer others, making them paradoxically better listeners, warmer friends, and more present partners than those whose constant talking is often beneath the surface more about managing their own discomfort than truly connecting with the people around them. It is worth addressing a common concern that arises when people first begin developing this quality. The fear that quiet confidence might be misread as arrogance, coldness, or aloofness by others who are used to more constant expressive communication styles. This concern is understandable, but in practice, the distinction tends to be clearer than people initially fear. Arrogance and coldness are typically communicated through dismissiveness, a lack of genuine attention toward others, or subtle signals of superiority, none of which are inherent to quiet confidence itself. A quietly confident person can be and often is deeply attentive, warm in their eye contact and body language, and genuinely curious about the people they are speaking with, even while saying considerably less than those around them. The quality that actually reads as cold or arrogant is not silence itself, but disengagement. A sense that a person has checked out of the interaction entirely rather than choosing deliberately to listen more than they speak. This is why the internal state behind the silence matters so much more than the silence itself. Restraint offered from a place of genuine presence and attentiveness feels entirely different to both the person offering it and the person receiving it than silence offered from a place of disinterest or emotional withdrawal. Even though both might look identical from a purely external behavioral perspective, cultivating this quality then is not simply about talking less. It is about ensuring that the attention and energy no longer spent on unnecessary speech is genuinely redirected toward deeper listening, closer observation, and fuller presence with whoever you happen to be speaking with in any given moment. So that what others experience is not an absence but a fuller, more concentrated version of your engagement than constant talking ever could have offered them. There is a final aspect of quiet confidence worth naming directly: the way it changes your relationship with your own mistakes and imperfections. People who rely heavily on constant talking, explaining, and justifying often do so, at least in part, because silence feels like it might be interpreted as agreement with a criticism or as an admission of failure they are not ready to acknowledge. Quiet confidence operates from a fundamentally different premise: the understanding that your worth was never actually contingent on being seen as flawless in every single moment, which means a mistake, a criticism, or an awkward silence following an error no longer carries the same threat it once did. This security allows for something that reactive, explanation-heavy communication rarely permits: the ability to simply acknowledge an error plainly without elaborate justification or defensive over-explanation and move forward. Ironically, this brief undefended acknowledgement tends to earn far more respect and trust from others than an elaborate defense ever could, because it signals a kind of psychological stability that constant justification actively undermines. People trust those who can sit comfortably with their own imperfections far more readily than they trust those who seem to need every mistake explained away immediately. And this trust compounds over time into exactly the kind of quiet, durable respect this chapter has been describing throughout. The sense that a person's value does not rise and fall with each individual interaction, but rests on a foundation considerably more stable than any single moment of speech or silence could threaten. Chapter 15. Reclaiming Your Power Through Restraint. We began this exploration with a simple, uncomfortable question: what if the smartest people in the room are not the ones talking? By now, that question should feel less uncomfortable and considerably more obvious, because everything explored throughout this journey points toward the same underlying truth: that real power, real influence, and real respect are rarely built through constant speech, reactive defense, or the anxious need to fill every silence with proof of your own value. They are built through discernment, through the discipline to speak when speaking genuinely serves the moment and to withhold when it does not, through the patience to let timing work in your favor rather than forcing every outcome immediately, and through the quiet internal security that no longer requires constant external validation to feel confident in your own worth. This is not a lesson that concludes with this final chapter. It is a practice that continues indefinitely, refined a little further with every conversation, every negotiation, every difficult moment where the old impulse to react immediately rises up and you choose deliberately to pause instead. Some days this practice will feel effortless, almost natural, as though the discipline has simply become part of who you are. Other days, particularly under real pressure, the old impulses will resurface. The urge to defend yourself instantly, to fill an uncomfortable silence, to have the final word in an argument that does not actually need one. This is not failure. It is simply the ongoing nature of any genuine skill, something that deepens with practice rather than something achieved once and permanently secured. What matters is not perfection, but the consistent direction of your effort. Choosing restraint a little more often than reaction. Choosing patience a little more often than impulsivity, and trusting even when it feels counterintuitive in the moment. That the quieter path is very often the stronger one. As you move forward from here, carrying this understanding into your relationships, your career, your negotiations, and the countless small daily moments where you decide whether to speak or to hold back. Remember that the goal was never to become silent, withdrawn, or emotionally unavailable. The goal was always to become deliberate, to reclaim the choice that impulsivity so often steals from us. The choice of when your voice, your reaction, and your energy will actually matter most. Use them there in those moments fully and without hesitation, and in all the countless smaller moments that do not require it. Allow yourself the quiet, powerful freedom of simply choosing not to. That freedom, more than any single tactic explored throughout this journey, is the true and lasting source of the power we set out from the very beginning. To understand before we close, it is worth returning briefly to where we began. The image of the loud room and the quiet person within it who seems at first glance to have nothing to offer. Hold that image once more, but look at it differently now than you did at the very start of this journey. That quiet person is not absent from the room. They are in many ways more present than anyone else in it, because their attention is not divided between speaking and thinking, defending and listening, performing confidence and actually feeling it. They are simply watching, absorbing, calculating, waiting for the moment when their voice will carry the weight it deserves, rather than spending it carelessly on moments that do not require it. This is not a lesser way of moving through the world. It is, as we have explored across every chapter of this journey, very often the more powerful one, the one that builds deeper trust, sharper judgment, and more durable influence than constant reactive speech ever could. You now carry an understanding that most people move through their entire lives without ever consciously examining. The recognition that silence is not empty, that patience is not passive, and that the discipline to withhold, chosen deliberately rather than out of fear, is one of the most underestimated forms of strength available to anyone willing to practice it. What you do with this understanding from here is entirely up to you. Some of what we have discussed will feel immediately natural, aligning with instincts you may have already been quietly developing on your own. Other parts will feel more difficult, requiring genuine, sustained effort to override habits built over years or even decades of reflexive speech and reaction. Both responses are normal, and neither should be treated as evidence of success or failure. This is a practice, not a destination. One that will continue to reveal new layers and new applications the longer you engage with it. In negotiations you have not yet entered, relationships you have not yet formed, and moments of pressure you cannot yet anticipate. Trust that the discipline you build now, one pause, one withheld reaction, one deliberately chosen silence at a time, will continue compounding quietly in the background of your life. The same way patience itself compounds, invisible in any single moment, but undeniable when you look back months or years from now at the version of yourself who is calmer under pressure, more respected in difficult conversations, and considerably more in control of outcomes that once felt entirely at the mercy of impulse and reaction. That version of you is not someone you need to become through some dramatic transformation. It is someone you are already quietly building, one deliberate silence at a time. Starting now, carry this practice forward not as a rigid rule to enforce upon yourself with harsh discipline, but as an ongoing conversation with your own instincts, a gentle, persistent question you learn to ask in the moments that matter most. Does this deserve my words right now? Or does it deserve my patience instead? Some moments will answer that question clearly and immediately. Others will remain genuinely uncertain. And in those uncertain moments, remember that erring toward restraint costs you very little. A delayed response, a slightly longer pause, a moment where you chose to observe rather than react while lingering toward impulsive speech when the moment did not actually call for it, can cost considerably more. Information given away too early, credibility spent unnecessarily, a reaction that cannot be fully taken back once it has been spoken aloud. This asymmetry, small cost on one side, potentially significant cost on the other, is itself a useful principle to hold on to whenever you are genuinely unsure which path a particular moment calls for. When in doubt, the quieter path rarely closes a door that speaking immediately would have kept open. But the reverse is very often true. Words spoken too quickly, too emotionally, or too carelessly, frequently close doors that patience would have kept available. Let that asymmetry guide you gently, not as a rule to follow anxiously, but as a quiet, reliable compass, pointing consistently toward the discipline this entire journey has been devoted to cultivating within you. The discipline of the smart, The patient, and the genuinely powerful who understood long before anyone else in the room did that some of the strongest moves available to any of us are the ones made not through speech but through the deliberate confident choice to remain. For now,